What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we are officially starting the Thanos War, is really what this is. I don't know which title is better, the Thanos War or Thanos invades Earth and steals a cosmic cube. Like I have no idea, the Cosmic Cube Saga, but that's basically what this is. It's the Cosmic Cube Saga. For those of you guys where we've talked about like Thanos' publication history, we've talked about the idea that Thanos invaded Earth once to steal the Cosmic Cube. That's what this is. That's what this story basically covers. But before we get into this, we need to talk about Captain Marvel. So Captain Marvel, or as I prefer to call him, Marvel, was basically like Marvel sticking it to DC. That's really all it was. Back in back in 1940s for the most part, really like the late 1930s, when Superman first appeared in Action Comics, Fawcett Publications, the president went to Bill Parker and CC Beck and said, give me Superman without Superman. And the result is that they made Captain Marvel. And so for a while, he was wildly popular. In fact, he actually outsold Superman. He doubled Superman's sales for quite some time. DC ultimately sued Fawcett Publications, and Fawcett had to take Captain Marvel off the shelves. Well, over the course of this lawsuit, because of the fact that DC ultimately won and then got the rights to the character and then basically put him on the back burner for 20 years, during this 20-year period, the copyright lapsed. And so Marvel immediately stole it. They basically said, okay, we're gonna copyright the name Captain Marvel and we're gonna create a superhero based on that name. That's why it is that when the original Captain Marvel came back in DC in the 1970s, they had to rename him to Shazam because they couldn't use the name. And so again, that kind of goes into the future of his character. But really, the Captain Marvel character, or Marvel as we're talking about here, this was Stan Lee and Gene Colan back in the day. And he was introduced in Marvel Superheroes number 12. Now, we've talked about this before. Marvel Superheroes was one of those multitude of publications that existed out there from comic book publishers who would basically use it as a test bed. Are fans interested in this character? And the result is that they would kind of switch characters out. So you might have a series of these anthology books or just kind of, singular stories that feature some interesting superhero, and you'll have like 3 of them in a row. And then, Marvel or DC or whoever will gauge the sales of that and decide whether or not people like it. And if they do, then they'll give them their own solo series and test that for a little while. And if it works, they'll keep it going. That's what they did with Adam Warlock. Ultimately, it didn't succeed because, Warlock kind of dropped off by the time issue number 12 came around. But the fact remains here that when it came to Marvel, the way he was originally done, fans didn't really like him. I mean, when Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Gene Colan were making this guy, basically it was this idea that he was just from a race called the Kree. And the Kree, of course, as we know, are one of those massive spacefaring empires that exist out there in Marvel Comics. They'd been around for quite some time, and they had ultimately sent a spy to Earth to monitor Earth to see if it was a threat. What ended up happening is in classic, Stan Lee manner of storytelling, the hero side of things came out, and Marvel basically became a good guy. He was therefore arrested by the Kree, eventually made his escape, but fans didn't really care for it too much. And so where eventually Roy Thomas took over the title and Marvel continued to make all these different changes, where they basically took the character of Rick Jones and they merged him with Captain Marvel by using the negabands that were hit together. Ultimately, it wasn't really until Jim Starlin took over the publication that people found it to be interesting. And this is why I say Jim Starlin was so important. And that's kind of the reasons why it kind of sucks that Marvel pushed him out, because the Marvel cosmic landscape wouldn't be where it is without Jim Starlin. Adam Warlock and Gamora and, Drax the Destroyer and, a lot of these cosmic escapades were designed for the purpose by Jim Starlin of really transitioning these characters to a cosmic landscape. Because under Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Gene Colan, Captain Marvel was an Earth-based character, but Earth was rapidly filling up with superheroes. And so, readers kind of had their pick of the litter, and it was very easy to kind of ignore certain superheroes if they didn't resonate. Now, again, the whole Captain Marvel Rick Jones thing, and that was in a lot of ways a tribute to the old Captain Marvel Billy Batson theme, which is to say, back in the day when Captain Marvel was made by DC, you had Billy Batson, who was a kid, he would shout the word Shazam, and then he would become Captain Marvel. This was designed to be the exact same way with Rick Jones. The difference here is that Captain Marvel, Marvel was basically thrown into the negative zone, and then eventually Rick Jones was contacted by the Supreme Intelligence, and the result was that, Rick Jones was led to the negabands, and when he struck them together, they would switch places, and they had like a 3-hour time limit. And so, for the most part, at the time this story picks up, Marvel is just kind of there. He's just kind of a superhero who exists alongside the other superheroes in Marvel. And really, he wasn't the highest seller at this point in time. So Marvel was trying to find a way to rework him. And so whenever we go through and we do character explanations and we say, by the time this writer came on board, their attempt was to rework this character and make it more interesting, this is exactly it. You guys are literally like over the course of this video, you're gonna be seeing that happen in real time, which is one of the reasons why it's kind of cool. But initially, Captain Marvel is just kind of set upon by all these different forces. Now, the way that the whole Rick Jones, Captain Marvel scenario was brought to us is that while they were only able to switch bodies by hitting the the negabands, they could communicate with each other. And so the result was that you would have Rick Jones who would chime in and he would talk to Captain Marvel about something, and they would even like communicate just based on regular things. If Marvel was trying to understand the world around him, because remember, he's not really of Earth. And so when he was trying to understand things that were still relatively new to him, Rick Jones would be the means by which he could achieve that. The problem with this is that he's basically led to a building where he's essentially arrested by a cop. And it is kind of intriguing because this cop is just kind of like, yeah, man, we saw you commit this crime and you're under arrest for murder. And then of course you end up having Luann Savannah who steps in and says, yes, I saw him commit that murder. I mean, obviously he's being framed, but Luann Savannah was the attempt of Marvel to bring a love interest in for the characters of Rick Jones and Captain Marvel. But the fact that Luann effectively turns against Marvel by saying, yep, I saw him commit this crime, then ultimately he's taken to jail, he's thrown in a cell, and he's given handcuffs, and that's really about it. But then suddenly he's met by these characters like Ronan the Accuser, Jan Rog, the Incredible Hulk. He's met by all these villains who suddenly seemingly start showing up out of nowhere and start attacking him. Now, in truth, this is Jim Starlin giving us a bit of a refresher course about the various foes that Captain Marvel's faced over the years, Metazoid and different things like that, Zarek and so on and so forth. These are beings that were introduced by like Stan Lee, Gene Colan, these kind of characters that were designed to sort of be, arch enemies of Marvel. They all played a role in some form or fashion. That role was largely isolated to the idea of Marvel having been part of the Kree, basically abandoning the Kree Empire in favor of becoming a superhero, and the various, accusations of treason that came out of that. That's really where a lot of that stuff comes from, his first conflict with Name of the Submariner, so on and so forth. But all this is basically revealed to be an illusion of sorts. What we also end up finding out here is that this act is basically being perpetuated by two beings. One of them is named Scrag, and the other one is Super Skrull. Now, Super Skrull is a character that we've never talked about. Well, I take that back. If we have talked about Super Skrull, it's really kind of making fun of him. And in truth, that's the only way to talk about him. Super Skrull was a Skrull that got the powers of the Fantastic Four. That's really all it was. He really was mostly an enemy of them, but he's one of those characters where when he pops up, it's just kind of like, but why though? I mean, there's so many other cool enemies out there. At the time, back in the 1960s, it was cool because the Fantastic Four were so huge, they were so popular. But nowadays, it's basically copying the powers of a team that nobody really cared about anymore. I mean, people care about the Fantastic Four now because they're not there, but if people really cared about the Fantastic Four, they wouldn't have been selling so bad in the first place. But the fact remains here that it is interesting when it comes to like how these different characters are introduced and so on and so forth. Not only that, we're basically told that, Super Skrull and Scrag are answering to some, other being out there, but they essentially set all this stuff up. They were the ones who were disguised as the cop. They were the ones that basically forced Luann, or seemed to force Luann, to basically say, yeah, I saw, Captain Marvel commit this murder, that kind of a thing. They were impersonating the Incredible Hulk. They were impersonating all these people, which is why they came in sections. They didn't all come at one time, is because it was the Skrulls acting in accordance to that whole idea. Now, of course, when they spill the beans, and of course they believe that Captain Marvel's knocked out, he's not, he pops up, battles them, and they end up just kind of having to escape. They essentially have to take off and essentially teleport away. Now, this kind of asks the question, what's going on and why is this happening in the first place? And so what we end up doing is we pick up with Marvel, who basically goes to meet Luann. And what Luann does is basically spill the beans. And this is when we start to get into the cosmic side of things. That little first tidbit where it was Marvel fighting the Skrulls, and the whole idea of Luann, that was the way his stories were all originally told. And they weren't that great. But the whole idea behind this is that Luann basically says that somewhere along the line, she was basically taken to a facility, or at least it seems like she was taken to a facility, whereby she was given some kind of an obedience disc, more or less. And that while the thing doesn't necessarily control everything she does, it does control certain words, certain keywords. But she also talks about the character of Thanos. Now, one thing to bear in mind here is this is technically the second appearance of Thanos. We already covered the first appearance when he fought Iron Man, when it was basically a robot Thanos and not the actual one. This is him effectively returning. Now, why it's all happening, we'll kind of flesh that out. But the fact that she says, this is Thanos and he rules Titan, the moon orbiting Saturn with an iron fist, he's essentially killed everybody that's actually living there, and instead it's being occupied by an army that he's formed. What she basically says is he's plotting and scheming to invade the Earth. And so it's kind of cool because of course where she, initially kind of begins to attack Marvel and he's able to subdue her to a degree, what we end up finding out is that she is being controlled 100%. It's just that it's Scrag and Super Skrull putting on this perception that she's not controlled in her entirety. Now, following this, we pick up with Super Skrull making his appearance and really showing up to attack Ben Grimm. Now again, because of the fact that Super Skrull was originally an enemy of the Fantastic Four, they're well aware of who he is. And of course, Ben Grimm immediately picks up on the fact that this is Super Skrull and responds accordingly, because Super Skrull says, well, if you really want to battle, meet me at, 414 West 44th Street. Now, the other half of this is that Luann says, well, this is where she was taken when this disc was thrown on her. So it's basically Jim Starlin kind of playing it fast and loose with the idea of, man, Ben Grimm might be taken possession of. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that while you might be looking at this and just kind of like, okay, so who cares? It's Ben Grimm. Back then, that was huge. Ben Grimm being used by an enemy and just becoming like this wrecking ball, it was pretty significant because back then, Ben Grimm was one of the only beings who could actually go toe-to-toe with the Incredible Hulk. He was that strong. That's how Marvel really kind of elevated its character and made him pretty significant. That and the fact that he was one of the founding members of the Fantastic Four, so he was already kind of etched in stone, no pun intended, as one of the more founding and significant members of Marvel Comics. The whole idea is that when he shows up in this building, his voice is immediately taken away. At the same time, because of the fact that Luann had said this is where she was basically put through the process of having a disc attached to her so she would be controlled, leads Captain Marvel to this location. And the whole idea is to essentially serve as a distraction of sorts. That if Captain Marvel was able to, basically get away from the accusations of murder, that they can in turn actually have him kill Ben Grimm. And the result is that he would essentially be put on trial for that. Now, this is kind of weird because it's one of those things where Mar-Vell could, but maybe he couldn't. I mean, with Ben Grimm, like if he fights at the absolute peak and he just keeps going and going, then sure, he'd probably be able to topple Mar-Vell. But the way that Jim Starlin plays this off is that Mar-Vell would be able to topple Ben Grimm. And that's the initial, kind of indication this is sent in. Essentially, Mar-Vell just kind of overpowers Ben Grimm by shocking him with electricity. And what this does is it basically takes that voice, paralyzer more or less, and it eliminates it in its entirety. And so what ends up happening here is Ben Grimm starts talking to Mar-Vell, and effectively they learn they've both been tricked here. Now, the other half is, remember, you still got Thanos watching all this unfold, and a cloaked figure's kind of skulking around in the background watching everything take place. So it is kind of cool because ultimately we end up having Ben Grimm and Captain Mar-Vell show up in the doorstep of where Thanos is operating out of, and when they break in, not only are they met with Thanos, they're also met with Mistress Death. Now, this is her first appearance in Marvel Comics, and it's very, very important that we talk about this. In Marvel Comics, when it comes to the idea of death and dying, there was no real definitive standard outside of like Hela from the Thor comics. Remember, it wasn't until 1975 when Chris Claremont took over the X-Men that things like the Phoenix were introduced. And we got places like the White Hot Room and these various indications of what the afterlife is like for people who die. Before this story right here, before the introduction of Mistress Death and the role she plays, essentially it was this idea that whenever people died, those who died in battle went to Valhalla. Those who didn't die in battle, they went to the realm of Hela. Now, going to the realm of Hela didn't mean you went to like fire and brimstone and hell. That was just the afterlife for anybody who didn't die in battle in honor of Asgard. That was essentially the only place you went to. With this story and the introduction of Mistress Death, what Marvel started doing, especially under the writing of Jim Starlin, is they started shifting things up. And so what they did is they sort of split the difference, because the question fans would have had is, okay, if up until this point we have Hela, who's the representation of death in Marvel Comics because there's nobody else who stands in for her character, then how do we justify the existence of Mistress Death, and are the two related to each other? Is, Hela just like a different aspect of Mistress Death or something like that? Marvel split the difference, and what they began doing is they basically said, okay, those individuals who did die in honorable battle and believe in Asgard, they go to Valhalla. Everybody else goes to the realm of Mistress Death, and that's it. So the average person living on the street that's like a Baptist Christian, they go to the realm of Mistress Death or something along those lines. And then we started getting into the introduction of characters like Mephisto, where Mephisto, his realm is for those individuals who he tricks and whose souls he steals. That's basically where that whole thing comes from. And there's all other kinds of afterlives that were introduced as well. Like there is an actual hell, there is an actual heaven. There's all these different things that kind of spun out of the introduction of Mistress Death, but that's why she's so important, because it opened the door that there's more to where people can go when they die than just Hela and the whole idea of Asgard and things like that. Now, this also set in motion the relationship between Mistress Death and Thanos. But one thing to keep in mind here is that this is the actual Thanos. It's not a robot Thanos that we saw in Iron Man number 55. And the whole idea behind this is that this version of Thanos is much, much stronger than his robot version. Of course, he immediately overpowers Ben Grimm. And again, 1960s comics, this is Jim Starlin's way of saying Thanos is nobody to trifle with. With the character of Mar-Vell, he immediately forces Mar-Vell and Rick Jones to switch places, which had never happened before. But with regards to the defeat of Mar-Vell, and with Rick Jones kind of being, with them being forced to switch and Rick Jones being the prominent character, Thanos basically grabs them and whisks off with the two of them. He just kind of absconds with Rick Jones. Now, what we end up finding out here is the motivation behind Thanos for doing this is to take the mind of Rick Jones, hook it up to the computer Isaac, which is the computer system that kind of governs everything that goes on with regards to the planet Titan, and find some secret that Rick Jones harbors. And what we get is this kind of play-by-play of the lives of the characters to a degree, the immediate past and how their powers work. So again, this is Jim Starlin kind of hitting at those things, kind of giving readers a refresher course on the character of Mar-Vell. But what we end up finding out is that the secret that Thanos is hunting for is the Cosmic Cube, that for whatever reason, Rick Jones knows of its location, and the location is on Earth. Now, this is not the first appearance of the Cosmic Cube. The first appearance of the Cosmic Cube came in Tales of Suspense number 79. Don't quote me on that. but it was basically a concept introduced by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. And it fit very well when it came to their line of storytellings because, the cosmic cube is basically a wishing box. That's really all it is. When a person is in possession of the cosmic cube, they can make anything a reality, even if it defies all forms of logic and reason and different things like that. Now, one of the things that people usually try to do is they try to provide a hierarchy of powerful artifacts. The heart of the universe versus the Infinity Gauntlet versus the cosmic cube. And how do these rank in accordance with one another? Well, in truth, there is a hierarchy, but there's not a hierarchy. You're talking about a power that's so extreme that they can all basically do the same thing. The difference is how they're used. That's the differing factor with regards to what these things can do. For example, the heart of the universe blinked out the entirety of the multiverse and destroyed all the cosmic entities, save for the one above all. That was the power of the heart of the universe, but that is a story that's out of continuity, and as far as Marvel's concerned, it never really even happened. But when it comes to the cosmic cube, when it comes to the Infinity Gauntlet, they can basically do the same thing. The Infinity Gauntlet's a lot more popular because of the Infinity Gauntlet story and the Infinity Stones and the fact that they've stood the test for so long in terms of readership and how they're used and who's acquired them and different things like that. But you could take the cosmic cube and you could replace the Infinity Gauntlet with the cube and it all still works. But originally the cube was introduced as an artifact belonging to a group called Advanced Idea Mechanics. And that introduced the notion that the cosmic cube basically is, or at least the cube shape itself, is a storage space for the energy of the Beyonders. Now, the idea of it being energy of the Beyonders, that wouldn't be really introduced until, God, I want to say Fantastic Four 214 or 215 or something like that. It was the unofficial sequel to Secret Wars 1 and 2. And it was the whole idea that like the Beyonders are these beings that exist outside the multiverse and that their energy can be accessed using a cosmic cube. And then if you have something to contain that energy, then it'll give you godly powers. You can do anything that you want to, control all of reality. That's kind of how all that stuff sort of fell into an explanation. But at the outset, when it was originally brought in, it was just a wishing box. And so the whole idea is that somewhere on Earth it resides and Thanos is looking to acquire it. The other half of this is that we're also met with Rick Jones, who's kind of, under all this rubble and all this stuff. And of course, he's met by the arrival of Eros and Mentor. Now, with the character of Eros, it was this idea that he's the brother of Thanos. And the whole motivation behind this is they are like the two that oppose Thanos as best they can. But Thanos has killed every other member of their race. So there's really nobody else there. Now, of course, Mentos, the fresh-making father of Thanos. Mentor was the one responsible for petitioning Kronos to create Drax the Destroyer, who's the guy that's basically out there to take out Thanos as often as he can. Right now, he's in hiding, and we'll find out where he is here in a little while. But when it comes to Eros and Mentor, they're just like the last vestiges of the rebellion against Thanos is really all it is. The idea behind this is that they basically kind of provide this history for the character of Thanos and really the whole landscape of Titan itself. Now, this is really designed for the purpose of a refresher for those individuals who don't really know any of the history of Thanos. We've covered him enough. I mean, we've done the origin of Thanos, we've done Thanos Explained. You're welcome to go check those out if you want to know the whole thing. It'll be in the Marvel Cosmic playlist, so you'll see all that cosmic stuff because this is what all that goes into. This is all leading up to Infinity War. But what ends up happening here is we end up having Rick Jones basically bringing back Captain Marvel, just because of the fact that he's conscious now. He can return his character and effectively kind of go forward as a superhero. At this point, we transition over to Thanos and to Mistress Death, who have arrived in all places, Louisiana. Apparently, the Cosmic Cube resides in Louisiana. Not really sure why. I guess for some reason it's just kind of, residing in the bayou. I don't know, somebody down in Louisiana got it, and they've just kind of been doing crazy stuff ever since. I have no idea. But Luann's also been sent on a mission by Rick Jones to contact the Avengers. And so that's why this is important, because this grabs the Avengers team and brings them into the story. Now, of course, Luann showing up here with the Avengers card of Rick Jones, which kind of a fun fact, back in the 60s, you had to have a card in order to get into Avengers Mansion. Otherwise, they wouldn't let you in. It was kind of funny. But with Luann showing up here using Rick Jones' card, and the fact that the Avengers know who Luann is, they of course let her in, and then Luann basically, promptly passes out as a result of her whole, emotionally and physically taxing ordeal. But picking up with Mentor alongside Eros as well as, Marvel, we basically have them like invade and attack the forces of Thanos, and they're taken out pretty quickly. I mean, this isn't designed to be a great big huge long drawn out conflict. I mean, it is to a degree in terms of the fight with Super Skrull, but all that's just because he's so powerful. But the other important thing to draw from this is that Marvel is kind of relishing in the fires of combat. Like, he's really getting into it, and he's getting overly excited into the whole battle. And it's designed to feed on the notion that Marvel loves conflict, and that's going to be a very important thing. And the reason why is because once he arrives at Avengers Mansion and is basically told by, Black Panther, hey, look, like Luann showed up here and Luann's struggling and she's probably going to die, he immediately freaks out, switches back to his form of Rick Jones, and then while he's in this sort of negative zone plane, he suddenly witnesses the character of Eon. Now, Eon, this is his first appearance, and we'll actually talk about him here in a minute, but he's one of the cosmic entities that exists out there, and he's actually responsible for the characters like Quasar, kind of being like the protectors of the universe, different things like that. But we'll talk more about that here here in a second. The whole idea behind this is that while Rick Jones is telling this story and then transforms back into Mar-Vell, and Mar-Vell basically tells the Avengers about how Thanos is trying to capture the cosmic cube, some alarm bells start going off with regards to an intruder. Of course, Black Panther's the first to respond. Black Panther's taken out. We end up having Vision who responds, and he's taken out. You know, Mar-Vell's telling them about these obedience discs and different things like that. And then ultimately we end up with the arrival of Controller. Now, Controller was a person who was basically invading the Avengers mansion and crushing each and every one of the Avengers. But, you know, when it came to the character of Basil Sandhurst, he's a weird scenario. So Basil Sandhurst, he originally appeared back in 1962, I think it was, and he was originally an Iron Man villain. And the whole idea behind this was that Basil Sandhurst was basically a guy who lived his life as a kid, always being sick, and so he was always bedridden for the most part. Eventually, he went on to basically become a scientist. He developed an exoskeleton, and what this suit did is it allowed him to essentially absorb the mental energies of other people into himself and then grant himself some measure of telepathy. Now, the difference here is that by the time this story came around, a multitude of schemes and campaigns had gone on. He'd conquered an entire town. He'd basically enslaved his brother, different things like that, but his powers have effectively been augmented by Thanos. And what this means is that these small little discs that are being attached to people, those were created by Controller. And it's for Thanos to essentially start attaching them to like high-ranking military officials, things like that, so none of them will question Thanos and will all be obedient and controllable by Thanos by virtue of Controller. And Controller does this just because of the fact that Thanos promises him different things and so on and so forth. So it's a classic henchman, you know, archetype that goes on here. But the whole idea is that Controller is wildly capable and extremely dangerous, especially with that whole exoskeleton. So he's pretty formidable in his own right with his enhanced abilities, different things like that. But for the character of Thanos, we jump back to him in Louisiana and basically deal with Drax the Destroyer showing back up. Now remember, Drax the Destroyer serves the purpose of looking to do nothing more than destroy Thanos. That's his purpose. That's why he was created. And the cool thing about this is that Thanos uses something called the Time Mind Sync Warp, which I've never seen used outside of this story. And as far as I'm aware, Jim Starlin was exceedingly well known for that. He was really, really good for grabbing a concept, throwing it into comics, and then it's never seen or heard from again. But the whole Time Mind Sync Warp is designed to essentially dominate the minds of other people. But this is very important. And the reason why this matters is because this demonstrates the fact that Thanos is well versed in the idea of manipulating the minds of others, as well as occupying a space that's designed to essentially demonstrate the effects of reality warping. This is one of the reasons why when Thanos gets the Reality Stone, he's able to control it and he's not immediately driven insane by it because his mind can already handle the effects of extreme reality warping. And so in this instance, it's designed to effectively break the mind of Drax the Destroyer. But Drax the Destroyer is driven by the lone singular purpose of killing Thanos. And so the result of this is that even though he's kind of pushed to the brink, even though he survives the experience and he's knocked unconscious, it does allow Thanos to access the cosmic cube and to effectively take off with it. And so what this does is this segues back into Controller and Captain Mar-Vell, and there's not really a whole lot going on there. I mean, Controller basically overpowers Mar-Vell and he grabs 2 stories of the Avengers building and just throws it on him, causing a massive collapse of the building, grabs Luann and then takes off, and then that's really about it. But what it does is it leaves Rick Jones under all this rubble, under the possibility of being crushed to death, but where he goes and strikes the Negabands in an attempt to bring Mar-Vell back, it doesn't work. And the reason why this doesn't work is because Mar-Vell has been brought before Eon. Now, Eon is, well, I guess if we can call him a child, Eon is like the offspring of eternity. And that's where Marvel gets a little crazy when it comes to the whole idea of entities. Eon is one of these beings that was created for the purpose of monitoring time on Earth. And he's been around for quite a while. I mean, he's been around forever and ever and ever and ever. But the whole idea was that Eon is kind of a response to the being Kronos, who had basically come along and said, okay, so like in a few billion years, like 3 billion years, Thanos is going to rise to power and he's going to try to conquer the universe. And so we need to have a means to prepare for that. And so what ended up happening here is that over the course of these billions of years, the cosmic entities just waited. Now, it would seem like that would be like kind of ridiculous. Like, why don't they just make a person to wait until then? Well, because when you're a cosmic entity, the passage of time doesn't pass like it normally does. You know, cosmic entities don't see time the way humans do. Humans analyze time based on, you know, the Earth's revolution around the sun and the number of times that Earth spins on its axis. When you're a cosmic entity, time is for the most part irrelevant to you because the universe will end, you will die, and then you'll be reborn. And then that's it. It's just kind of a death and rebirth. And so because of that, what would seem like 3 billion years for us would be like the blink of an eye for cosmic entities. It wouldn't really be relevant to them, you know? And so as a result, essentially what they've been doing is waiting on the character of Mar-Vell. Now, in terms of publication, like on the publication side, stepping out of the comic book landscape, this is Jim Starlin reworking the character of Mar-Vell. It's Jim Starlin sitting down and saying, okay, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Gene Colan, Roy Thomas, they made him an Earth-based superhero and fans didn't like it. So what if we make him a cosmic superhero? What if we have him go to the stars and he explores space and all those different things like that? Let's just see what happens and let's see how fans respond to that. It's basically the idea that Eon appears before Mar-Vell and says, what we need is a champion. We don't need a warrior. We don't need a person who's obsessed with conflict. And that's the whole point that takes place here. Eon essentially looks at the life of Mar-Vell and says, you have been forged in the fires of combat, and that's all you've known is war and conflict. So long as you get to fight, you don't really care what else goes on. But that's not what the universe needs. The universe needs a protector, not necessarily a person that can defeat every single threat in existence, but a person who knows which people to pull in case there is a massive conflict, a leader for the cosmos of sorts. Now, this is very important. This is a very significant thing because Mar-Vell would basically kick the bucket and die in 1984 with the death of Captain Marvel. What this did is it allowed for Jim Starlin to bring back the character of Adam Warlock and have Adam Warlock take the place of Mar-Vell in the role of Infinity Gauntlet. But the fact remains here, what Mar-Vell is basically experiencing in this scenario is one, the character of Uma, this woman that he was in love with, who ultimately ended up dying. He's given this perception of, hey, look, your battle with Jan Rog, the whole Psych Magnetron, all those things, that was all in a desire to bring this woman back to life, which I as Eon can do. And he basically resurrects her, but she's soulless. She lacks the one thing that makes all sentient beings the way they are. She lacks a soul. She doesn't have the ability to like think for herself. She's just kind of a mindless shell that's out there. And Eon essentially says, this is what you would have gotten. Had you resurrected her from the dead, this is what you would have had, because she's gone. Her soul is off in the afterlife and you can't get that back. Now, this is Jim Starlin kind of hinting at the idea that Mistress Death is the gatekeeper, that when a person dies, you can't just bring them, you can't just resurrect them in a traditional sense. It's essentially Jim Starlin saying Mistress Death is the gatekeeper and she's holding all the keys. When a person dies, their spirit, their soul goes to her realm and they can only leave if she allows them to. That can happen, where she's like, okay, fine, you can have your soul, you can go back and you can go back to your regular body. Sometimes she'll even send a person out of the realm of death and then ban them from ever coming back. It was kind of crazy when it came to that whole thing. But the fact remains here, what he's basically experiencing is something called cosmic awareness. That's basically what he's being given here. He's being given this idea that, where his physical form changes, he gets blonde hair, he gets a new uniform, he's basically being given cosmic awareness. There's nothing in the universe that goes on that he doesn't know about. He's effectively aware of everything. He's aware of all life that's tingling all across the universe. Now, in truth, Mar-Vell's not the first person to ever achieve that, and he won't be the last when it comes to publication history. But how people deal with that is really contingent on the writer. A lot of writers, they'll depict it in a way where a person's, given cosmic awareness and they start to go insane because it's a massive influx of all this energy coming in all at once. It's not just people talking, it's the alignment of the planets, it's the rotation of the planets, it's black holes, it's stars traveling, asteroids and comets just racing across the spaceways. It's this massive influx of energy that all comes in at once. Now, Jim Starlin plays it fast and loose, and he's just like, yep, he's got cosmic awareness now. Cool story, bro. But like most writers are just kind of like, they go absolutely insane, they lose their mind, and it takes somebody of extreme power to bring them back down and to have them regain their sanity and kind of go forward. That's usually how that plays out. I mean, if this story had been told in like 2002, he would have gone nuts, and it probably would have taken someone like Xavier or something like that to bring him back down. He would have attacked all the Avengers or something along those lines. It would have been a lot different. But because of the fact that this story is told at a time when it was more about the fantasy of superheroes as opposed to the grounded nature of heroes in relation to how they would exist in the real world, he just gets cosmic awareness. He's like awesome, and he goes forward as like the one guy that has the ability to unify our superheroes in an effort to stop Thanos. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.